All right, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us nice and early in the morning, especially for some of you more than others. But we're all here for Castle Williams' dissertation defense. And I've had the pleasure of working with Castle since he was an undergraduate here. So this is it's been a really nice several years getting to work with you and to see you get to this point. Just introduce this committee. Gina Esco from NOAA, thank you for joining us. And then our UGA members, Dr. Alan Stewart and Marshall Shepard. And we're still waiting for one other committee member, so hopefully we will all be complete. And I'm the major advisor here. And the usual way we do our dissertation defenses in our department is I'll have Castle give a 30 or so minute presentation, and then I'll open it up for questions from all of you. And then we'll close the meeting to just the committee and Castle. And then when our committees ask questions, then we'll go into a breakout room and have a private discussion. So with that, Castle, would you like to take it away?
Yes, 1 second. Okay, let me do my share screen. Can everyone see that? Yes?
She just said she's going to log in 5 minutes.
Okay.
So she said to begin without her. So why don't you just get started and she'll join us.
And everyone can see the presentation, not presentation mode, right?
I can see presentation mode.
Okay, that's what I was afraid of. 1 second. How about now?
You're good.
Okay. Excellent, excellent. So good morning, everyone. Thank you again for coming to my dissertation defense. I know it's early. I would have brought coffee, but I can't do that virtually. But I appreciate everyone for coming. So in thinking about my dissertation, I was really interested in this idea of message consistency and what that means for the weather community. So to explore that, I asked this kind of provocative question of, should our severe weather graphics wear a uniform? And so to do that, I conducted 3 different projects, which I'm going to discuss today. So to jump right in, thinking about why is message consistency important is kind of this big question to begin this presentation with. We see that in risk communication literature, the message consistency is considered this critical component. But the problem lies in trying to transfer that to practice. There's not a lot of information on how we ensure or even achieve message consistency for practitioners. It's really nice in theory, but when we try and move it to practice, we have some challenges. And so when we think about this in the weather community, it's ever important because of the number of trusted sources and just the sheer volume of available weather information that we have. Because of this, although it's a really great thing that we can do this in our community, it increases the opportunity for us to encounter inconsistent or for our audiences to perceive that our messages may be inconsistent. And so lastly, there's this assumption that inconsistency is bad and causes confusion among the many publics. And we feel as though this is true, but we don't have a lot of empirical evidence in our community that can really give us that really nice insight on whether this is true or not. So this was kind of a major driver of my dissertation, was really trying to understand if inconsistency is this quote unquote bad thing. So when we think about consistency concerns in the weather community specifically, I'm sure many of you have seen on weather Twitter where meteorologists kind of go at each other on thinking about and talking about convective outlook graphics. And so when we think about consistency, there are all different ways in our community that it comes up, but the most frequent way is when we talk about these convective outlook graphics and when they are different across different sources in the weather community. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see an example of this, where on the left side, we see the Storm Prediction Center's graphic where they show Birmingham in this enhanced risk category region for severe weather. Then on the right side, you see the local weather forecast office graphic showing Birmingham in a moderate risk area. So these are for the same forecast period, but they're showing Birmingham in different risk categories. But this goes beyond like internally within NOAA and more broadly to the weather enterprise, where we can see another example here at the bottom where the Storm Prediction Center graphic on the left side is showing Atlanta in the moderate area, But on the right side, a local TV station graphic is showing Atlanta still in a moderate area, but with a different color. They're using kind of this magenta color to articulate the moderate area that we normally use for the high risk category area in the Storm Prediction Center graphic. So there are some inconsistencies that exist, and they stretch beyond just colors and risk categories. People use different risk category language. There are all types of inconsistencies that exist in our community. But what we really don't know is whether there are implications for this inconsistent graphical information, or whether members of the public or our end users also similarly identify these graphical differences as inconsistent, and what maybe some of their effects are on those end users. So that was really the motivation for my dissertation, was to be able to provide guidance or best practices on how to achieve a more consistent message in the weather enterprise. And I wanted to lastly throw up this quote, because this was really an inspiration for my dissertation, which comes from Dr. Gina Esco's thesis work, where she said, if all sources of weather information use the same forecast, but different visual designs, does this change the consistency of the message? And that is really kind of the crux of the question that I'm trying to answer. And so within that question, if having a different visual design does change the consistency of the message, does that mean that our messages or our graphics should wear a uniform? And that's the question that I'm trying to explore. And so to do that, I had 3 research questions in particular that kind of outline 3 different projects for my dissertation. The first being trying to identify and define what message consistency is for weather enterprise researchers and practitioners. So before we kind of dive deep into thinking about how message consistency may affect our end users, it's important to know how to define it and to operationalize it for our research. So that was the first research question. The second one was trying to get a better understanding of how members of the public evaluate whether Convective Outlook graphics are consistent or not. And the third question was really focused in on understanding how graphical inconsistencies affect end users, if at all. So we looked at whether end user risk perception, uncertainty, information seeking intentions, and behavioral intentions to perform protective actions differed as a result of these graphical inconsistencies. So jumping into the first research question, you'll remember it's about defining message consistency for the weather enterprise. And so when I started this project, I thought it was important that we first look to the weather enterprise to define message consistency. How are they thinking about this concept? If we're all thinking about it the same way, then that makes it kind of easy, and it makes it really straightforward on how we should think about this concept in both research and practice. But when I looked at meteorologists and the weather community more broadly, it seems as though they are split into 2 opposing camps. So on the left side, you see that some meteorologists think about message consistency and equate it with uniformity. So when they think about being consistent, they think about, oh, well, everything is uniform across all sources, all platforms, etc. But then there are some meteorologists kind of on the other side, like on the right side of the slide, you see they kind of equate similarities in our messages to being consistent. So being similar and being uniform is different, and they have different operational end goals. So if we want everything to be uniform, that's going to look completely different if we want everything to be similar. So this in itself provided some insight that we needed some sort of definition in order to address these consistency concerns in the weather enterprise, so we could all get on the same track, and to create this path on how we kind of think about being consistent in practice. So in order to define message consistency, what we started with were recorded community efforts. So I wanted to start by listening to the weather enterprise and to meteorologists to think about, well, how are they thinking about message consistency? What concerns do they have? What practical constraints or challenges are they kind of struggling with in terms of message consistency? So in order to do that, I recorded and transcribed several different community efforts, which included webinars, conference sessions and panels, workshops, all these different kinds of events that really helped us understand where they were coming from and their position and their struggles and challenges. And once that happened, I looked at these transcripts through a content analysis, which basically means I examined them to identify like repeated words and phrases and different ideas and themes that arose throughout each of these recorded community efforts to kind of understand what are the main takeaways that we're seeing that are very similar across all of the recorded community efforts. And then that itself revealed several themes, big themes that emerged, and it really helped drive a social science literature review so that we could combine both social science literature and kind of the thoughts and practice information from the community in order to combine those two together to come to a conclusion on how to define message consistency. So these are the 5 themes that emerged from the community efforts. And I won't go into them in too much detail, but I will kind of elaborate a little bit. So the first theme you'll see is that a working definition is needed. So this repeatedly comes up across each and every consistency conversation that we have in the weather enterprise, because it's kind of like a chicken or the egg problem, where we really want to come up with best practices, but it always comes back to, well, we don't know how to define message consistency, so we can't do that. So a working definition was really of concern to the community. The second being that inconsistencies often arise in the individual parts of a message. So when the weather community had trouble defining what being consistent looked like, they kind of flipped the script and started asking, well, what does inconsistent look like? And so they started thinking about how do inconsistencies arise? And they started looking at example messages in our community, and they identified that those individual parts of a message, like the colors that are being used or the risk category language that's being used, those in itself create or cause the inconsistency in the larger takeaway message. So that was really kind of a big element for them. And this leads really nicely into themes 3 and 4, which identify that there are specific message features or those individual parts that likely play a role. And they weren't really sure what those parts or those message features were. But a lot of meteorologists highlighted and mentioned that protective action information was very important to remain consistent. And some meteorologists even said it should be uniform or identical across messages. So that in itself kind of showcases that the community is picking out these really important elements of this definition. And finally, the weather enterprise kind of highlighted the need for a weather authority. In thinking about all these conversations, they constantly go back to the who question, like who is going to do this? Who's going to help us facilitate this? Once we come up with a definition, then like how are we going to implement it? Who's going to help us do that? So those were the 5 big themes that emerged from those efforts. And so what we did was go back and kind of tie each of those themes back to certain interdisciplinary literature in order to really provide context to some of the questions and concerns that the weather enterprise had, and really searched for literature that really helped address those questions or those answers, or helped us like better understand and fill out some of their thoughts on the definition. So I created this pyramid, and it's a really nice way, I think, of visualizing all the different layers that went into our definition of message consistency and how the literature kind of better articulates how to define message consistency. So on this bottom layer here, you see that it says conflict often results in inconsistency. And that was from the philosophical literature. So we wanted a starting place. So we went to philosophy and logic, because when you think about it, at the end of the day, whether 2 things are consistent or not is kind of this logic problem. And really the big takeaway from this literature is that conflict is the really big important element in how we identify inconsistencies. So that was a really nice building block for our developing of this definition. The second element came from the persuasion, communication, and psychological literatures, where they too identify that these individual parts of a message matter. And the persuasion communication literature calls them message features, but they really highlight that the individual parts of a message are important, and they show that there's evidence that manipulating different parts of a message can affect the overall takeaway message. Then the last 3 layers were really important in helping us understand how to define message consistency. So we found this literature called the conflicting information literature, which is basically a discipline of health communication, where they deal with all kinds of inconsistent, conflicting health messages. And they're really beneficial in helping us define it based on their conceptualization and their conceptual definitions. But more importantly, they really point out further what individual parts of a message matter. They really tie back to these efficacy or the behavioral or protective action parts of a message, but also the risk parts of a message. They kind of lay out that those are important as well. And last but certainly not least, the top of the pyramid was really interesting because it kind of provided some evidence to that question that I asked at the beginning. Are there negative effects? Is inconsistency bad? And this literature points to yes, there are negative effects that occur when inconsistent information happens. So each of these parts together really helped us come and create this definition of message consistency. So again, drawing on all of those different fields and literatures, we were able to define message consistency as two or more weather messages that must attain an optimal amount of similarity without producing any negative or adverse effects. So by definition, then the messages must convey the same overall message, even though their individual features may differ. And you'll see a lot of the key themes and takeaways that I just highlighted from that pyramid of literature, but also from the Weather Enterprise. So remember this similarity idea, that being important to be similar but not different. But then this idea of negative or adverse effects was really important in that communication and that conflicting information literature. So that is included here. But also this idea that we're maintaining this same overall message, even though the individual features can differ, as long as they don't start changing that same overall message. So this is our working definition of message consistency, and it really helped us start to create this idea of how we should define it and how we can start operationalizing it in future research. So now that we have a definition of message consistency, we can ask, is a consistent message achievable? And that's where this definition doesn't really quite provide enough information. Again, when we listened to meteorologists, we revealed that there are lots of different practical constraints that call into question the feasibility of achieving it. And as such, we just need more researchers and practitioners to work together to really design, to iterate, and develop this message evaluation process together. Because as a weather event evolves, we're constantly seeing new information come in. Information has to go out very quickly, and it's hard for us to enforce or to ensure that our practitioners are evaluating messages in real time. They just don't have the time and resources to do that, nor do they have time to ask their audience whether they are perceiving it to be consistent. So there are lots of practical challenges that still exist, but we're on the right path. This is a great first step forward, and we can, I think, figure this out together as a community. So with that, I will move on to the second project, which, if you'll remember, is really talking to end users and trying to figure out how they're thinking about this evaluation process of consistency. So I kind of just pointed out and talked about it, but when we developed our definition of message consistency, we showed that there's this kind of there's a lack of input from end users and individuals who receive these weather messages. And they're ultimately this really important group of end users, because without them, without their knowledge of whether they identify our messages as consistent or not, it's hard to really say that we've achieved something being more consistent. So it's really important to get their feedback and their understanding of how they're thinking about message consistency, so that we can come back and create messages that are more tailored to them, that offer more consistent messages. So understanding how our audience or our end user understands consistency will ultimately help us develop more consistent messages as meteorologists. So in order to do this, I thought that a qualitative approach would be best, so that we could really dig deep, get some really great understanding of how people are evaluating message consistency. I could continuously push and ask them questions about what they're thinking, what's running through their mind. So in order to do this, I created a scenario-focused, semi-structured interview instrument, which really helped me sit down one-on-one with people, have them walk through different scenarios of graphics, and really understand how they're approaching this idea of evaluating consistency and what that looks like in their minds. And I did this in Athens, Clarke County, and we got a pretty diverse sample of participants. And just so you have some context as we're going over the results, there were 30 completed interviews, and they were 60 to 90 minutes on average. So this is the first scenario that I showed participants, and you'll notice at the bottom of the screen, there is kind of an outline of what is going on in this scenario itself, like what was the point of it, what was the the interest in doing this. So you can see what we did with the first scenario was started them off with nearly identical graphics. They're both from the same source. And one of them is just kind of a zoomed in aspect of the convective outlook graphic. So they use uniform colors, uniform language, and uniform like risk areas. The shapes themselves are the same. And then when we asked participants, do these graphics communicate the same message? 25 out of the 30 participants said yes. So pretty good start. So then with the last three scenarios, we intentionally manipulated or showed graphics that manipulated different elements that we commonly see in the meteorological community that raise concern. So for example, in this second scenario, you can see they now have traveled to Birmingham, Alabama. The graphic on the left shows Birmingham in an enhanced region, or that orange region, but on the right, the graphic shows Birmingham in a red or moderate area. So when we asked participants about that change, about these two graphics, only 2 out of the 30 thought that this communicated the same message. When we moved to scenario 3, we were curious about the basic graphic design. So for example, when broadcasters use like lower thirds or a legend, they kind of move it to a different area, or they use a banner across the top. Does this impact the consistency of the message? So that was really the big impetus for scenario 3. And what we found was not really. So 24 out of 30 participants thought these two messages communicated the same thing. And then last, scenario 4 was really focused in on using different colors, using different risk category language, and using different risk category systems. So you'll see the graphic on the left here shows Athens in this yellow or slight region, but on this graphic, it shows Athens in the scattered or orange region. So the risk area boundaries are the same. You'll notice that the curves of the boundaries are the same, but the way that the source identified and changed the colors, the words, etc., was different. And when we asked participants about this message, 0 out of the 30 thought that this communicated the same message. And so this in itself was very informative, right? It gives us some indication about some of the elements that are more important, less important when we're thinking about message consistency. But the benefits of having a qualitative study is that we get to push them a little bit more. We get to ask them, what are you thinking? What's going through your mind? To really better understand what they're thinking about when they're evaluating these messages. So what we found were several themes that emerged, or these different elements that really affected two graphics being able to communicate a consistent message. The top 2 things that frequently arose where people felt as though the 2 graphics communicated different severity or likelihood messages. So that in itself kind of makes sense. Maybe one of the graphics feels as though the weather's can be more severe to them. The other one, being likelihood messages, was maybe one of the graphics shows them in a different risk category or something that makes them feel less or more likely of seeing severe weather at their location. But then when we move, then there were other more specific ways that the graphics were conflicting to them and created this different message. And that being number 3, again, moving a location to a different risk category. 4, using a different color scheme. 5, different geographical scales. So for example, maybe one graphic shows a regional area, the other one shows kind of a zoomed in local area. If that's the case, then maybe they communicate different messages. Number 6, we see different types of information. So what this means is that some of the graphics may have revealed information about timing or the threats that they would likely receive. So if maybe one emphasized hail and the other one didn't, then that would create this different message. Then the last 2 are different color vividness. So when we think about maybe one graphic shows a more saturated color like this square on the left, and that to them kind of conveyed a more severe message. And then lastly, different risk category words or systems. So they used, again, those different words to convey the risk categories, or maybe they used 3 risk categories instead of 5 that we normally see with the Storm Prediction Center. But when I started thinking about this more and thinking about all these different themes and kind of categories that came away from this question, I really started to identify that there was a larger pattern that emerged. And that was that that really the different severity messages and different likelihood messages were these broader themes that each of these more specific themes fit under nicely. So you will likely recall from my description just a few seconds ago, but when we showed participants different color vividness, some of them thought the more saturated color indicated a more severe message. Similarly, if a graphic changed a location's risk category, that affected the likelihood message that they would see. So when we identify these specific categories, it likely creates a different understanding of what the message entails or means. So there are likely specific tangible ways that the likelihood and severity messages are being changed or manipulated, which I think is a really interesting finding. So in addition to how people understand and evaluate message consistency, I also looked at people's reactions to inconsistent information. And that usually happened across 3 different stages. The first being this initial emotional response to them managing the conflicting information or trying to figure out how to resolve it in some way. And thirdly, offering recommendations to figure out how we can reduce conflicting information. So the best way I know how to evaluate or showcase the emotions that I witnessed in front of the person was to use emojis. So we see people that are confused. They're not really sure what's going on. People were angry and upset, like physically upset, like their faces were getting red. They were just trying to figure out why someone would lie to them, why someone would do this to them. Like that was their emotional response. Some people had their minds blown. They weren't really sure what was going on or which graphic they should trust. And then some people were just kind of like, we know this happens in weather. The atmosphere is kind of uncertain. So it makes sense that we're going to see graphics that are different too. In terms of managing conflicting information, the number one thing that we saw was that people assumed that the time was different or had changed. When they saw 2 graphics, they assumed that if they were different, then one of them was just out of date or that one of them had been updated. So to kind of explain away the conflicting information, they thought, oh, the time has just changed. So I'm going to look at the one that shows my location as more severe and go with that. Other people were more understanding that conflicting information may exist out in the world. And when that happened, they thought, oh, well, I'm going to go to my local meteorologist. That's my go-to source of information when conflict arises. Other people simply chose to ignore the conflicting information completely and avoid any information that those 2 sources told them and just do what their gut told them to do, which is pretty scary in my opinion. But then other people were more active in how they manage conflicting information, where they specifically searched for more information to clarify the conflict, or they looked at the 2 graphics together and came up with like a collective information source. We sometimes call this consensus forecasting in our community. And then lastly, when participants, after they had managed the conflicting information, they were like, well, you know what? We should try and reduce this in the future. So they gave me specific recommendations on what they think our community should do in order to reduce conflicting information. A lot of people were really drawn to the color schemes and the risk category language, and they thought those should be standardized or used in a uniform way. But this last suggestion was one of the ones that I really appreciated and thought was a really nice insight from an individual, which was, it's fine if the Convective Outlook graphics are different or if a local source needs to change them or modify them. But we want to know. We want them to be transparent with us about why they're doing it, that they have done it, and providing us more information on just like why this is happening. So I thought that in itself was really interesting too. So major takeaways for this study were when operational meteorologists alter those specific graphical elements, so for example, change the risk areas or colors, they likely also unintentionally affect the likelihood and severity messages that are being communicated by the Convective Outlook graphic in the process. Not only that, but this study also clarifies the definition that I went over in the first project by demonstrating that when we said the same overall message, it likely demands that end users walk away with the same feeling of risk. But I should also note that the Convective Outlook graphic doesn't show or change any self-efficacy or like any behavioral or protective action information. So it's impossible for us to kind of identify whether that's the case here. And then lastly, it appears that the basic graphical design changes do not impact the consistency of the message. But what does matter are the specific graphical elements. Again, those are really important. So now moving on to the third research question. Again, here the motivation was really focused in on understanding how these inconsistencies may affect end users and members of the public. And so to do this, we conducted 2 experimental studies with over 1,500 college undergrads. The first experiment being exploring the 5 graphical types of inconsistencies that we identified in the interviews with members of the public to determine which ones resulted in the lowest perceived consistency. And then we used those results to inform experiment number 2, where we took the inconsistency types that produced the most, to produce the least perceived consistency, and evaluated the effects on end users. So starting with experiment 1, so when we identified those 5 graphical inconsistencies during the in-person interviews, we were able to kind of make those into convective outlook graphic stimuli. So we're able to kind of create those again using a template that a broadcast meteorologist provided us with. So you can see that here, the original graphic. So when we do a risk area change, you can see Atlanta's now in the high risk area. The colors are a little bit different from the original. It's hard to see, but the risk category words here are a little bit different from the Storm Prediction Center's words. The number of categories, so instead of a 5 category system, we used a 4 category system. And then we did a kind of a regional zoomed out perspective when we were really curious, again, which one produced the lowest perceived consistency. So when we conducted our statistical analysis, we noticed that there was a significant difference between the different groups, but when we had to conduct post hoc analyses to really figure out which ones in particular were standing out. So you can see here that risk area change, so changing a location's risk category, and the colors were both significantly different from the other graphical inconsistency types. So using that information, we then moved on to experiment 2 to explore those manipulations a little bit more, and specifically to identify their effects. So to do this, we used a 3x2x2 experimental design. So it's a little bit more complicated than the one we used in experiment 1. And I won't spend too much time going over this, but just to kind of articulate what each of these numbers means. So when we say 3 for the risk area, that just means there were 3 different risk area conditions. So we had a change to a higher risk category, a no risk change category, and a change to a lower risk category. The 2 colors, they either had identical color schemes or different color schemes. And the boundary, one was on a risk boundary and one was not on a risk boundary. When we talked to our SPC partners, they were really interested in understanding more about the risk boundary. So we thought it would be important to manipulate that as well. I can't show you all 12 experimental conditions on one slide. So I just wanted to give you a little information on how we manipulated the graphics. You'll see that they're very similar to experiment 1. With this one being a risk area change. So Atlanta goes from a moderate to a high risk category. In the color change condition, we now have chosen to use the Weather Channel's color scheme. We wanted to be more practical in real life in the way that we were doing our manipulations. So we chose their color scheme for that. And then here you can see that on a risk boundary, we have operationalized that by moving Atlanta onto the risk boundary between the moderate and the high. So it's kind of this increase in risk for that. So looking at the results. So first we wanted to evaluate whether we had a successful manipulation. So we looked at perceived consistency. And you can see like experiment 1, we saw significant differences in each of the manipulations that we saw. If we changed a risk category, it was significantly different from the uniform risk category condition. Changing the color scheme significantly lowered perceived consistency, and when a risk boundary, when a location was not on a risk boundary, it was significantly lower from being on a risk boundary. So if we move to perceived susceptibility and perceived severity, if we start over here with perceived susceptibility, we see that the risk area changes and risk boundary changes were both significant. But when we look a little bit closer, and conduct post hoc analyses, we see that when we change a location to a lower risk category, that significantly lowers perceived susceptibility. But when we change a location to a higher risk category, it does not. It's the same as the uniform risk category, which is a pretty unique finding and may provide some insight that being uniform when we're showing risk information may be valuable. In terms of risk boundary, we see very similar story. When participants were not on a risk boundary, they saw significantly lower perceived susceptibility, and that plays over into perceived severity as well. It's also important to note that you'll likely see that color is not up here because changing the color scheme did not affect perceived susceptibility or severity in a significant way. Looking at perceived efficacy and behavioral intentions, because again, the convective outlook graphic doesn't show any protective action or behavioral information, it was important to look at this as well. So the overall story here, if you want to see, is that the average self-efficacy is lower than the average response efficacy, which just means that people feel as though a lot of these protective action behaviors are beneficial to them in being able to reduce their severe weather risk. But in reality, they don't feel as confident being able to perform them themselves, which I think is a pretty interesting finding, considering that convective outlook graphics don't show protective action information. And if we look more closely at these top two protective actions, we see that they have the greatest difference between their self-efficacy and their response efficacy. In particular, this preparedness item I think is pretty interesting because people feel as though having an emergency, severe weather emergency plan is important to them, but they don't really feel as confident in being able to create one themselves. So this points to maybe the addition of preparedness messages alongside the convective outlook graphic may be able to kind of equalize these different perceptions of efficacy. When we looked at behavioral intentions, we conducted an ANCOVA analysis and noticed that there were no significant differences in behavioral intentions. So this means that when we showed them different risk categories, different color schemes, or being on a risk boundary or not, this did not affect how they performed severe weather protective actions. The last two variables are perceived uncertainty and information seeking. You'll see here kind of the opposite of what we saw with perceived susceptibility and severity. Here, color changes are the big story. So when we did change the color scheme, that affected both perceived uncertainty and information seeking intentions. However, changing a graphic's risk category or risk boundary did not. And lastly, we're interested in whether combining the different types of graphical inconsistency had this sort of additive effect on perceived consistency. And there are two big things I want you to take away from this graphic. The first being the great difference between when we implement one type of inconsistency. So for example, if we start here, this being the uniform condition, the 6.076, and look down to this 4.556, that's when we change the color alone, like only the color changes. You see this dramatic drop. And you see the same dramatic drop when we change a risk category as well. But when we change both color and risk category, you don't see quite a significant of a drop as when we see one type of inconsistency. So this kind of hints at this idea that it only takes one inconsistency to affect perceived consistency. And the other thing to look at is, again, these two areas are significant. They're significantly different from each other. That's why they're highlighted in these boxes. But we don't see this significance when we do this change to a lower risk. So because we don't see this in all three risk categories, it cannot be an additive relationship, even though it gets lower when we add color and risk category. It's not significant, so we're not seeing this additive relationship. And when we look at the other variables, we see kind of a similar story. They didn't produce any significant interactions, so we did additional analyses to look at the combined effects. And although the combined effects of different inconsistency types produced greater means than their solo counterparts, they didn't really provide any large effect sizes, and were not really significantly different from the other experimental conditions. So we don't really have a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that combining the different inconsistency types has kind of this additive effect on perceptions of end users. So, and the major takeaways again from this would be showing two convective outlook graphics with different risk categories, color schemes, and risk boundaries did affect participants' perceived risk. uncertainty, and information-seeking intentions. And because we saw that changing a graphic's risk category to a lower category did impact perceived susceptibility, but raising it to a higher one did not, it points to there may be value in depicting uniform risk information instead of trying to upgrade a category or a location to a higher category. We also saw that participants reported that they did not intend to behave any differently as a result of the graphical inconsistencies, and that once we introduced one graphical inconsistency, subsequent ones didn't really have a significant impact on end user perceptions. So final conclusions and research guided recommendations based on my dissertation. So at the beginning, I posed this question of, should our convective outlook graphics wear a uniform? And I think based on these results, no is the answer. We should still have our operational meteorologists be able to customize the basic graphical design of the convective outlook graphics. They can use logos, legends, lower thirds. They can move these different items around on a graphic. But what we did identify are that certain graphical elements should remain the same. And if they don't remain the same, then this changes the overall takeaway message that end users walk away with when they're looking at a convective outlook graphic. So based on that finding, it is recommended that when possible, operational meteorologists should strive to maintain the same risk areas and color schemes used by the Storm Prediction Center's convective outlook graphic. Now, when I say this, I think there's an important caveat that if the Storm Prediction Center were to provide an update or move a location to a higher risk category, then you should by all means kind of follow that and provide your end users with information on why it was updated or if it was updated. But basically what I'm trying to get at with the findings of my dissertation are that we need to eliminate the deliberate use of graphical inconsistencies when sharing convective outlook graphics. I think if we do that as a community together, we can start moving toward a more consistent message. So lastly, I want to quickly acknowledge the University of Georgia, my committee, Dr. Grunstein, all of my support system, all of you on this call. I really appreciate you being here and being with me throughout my PhD, but also throughout the last 10 years at UGA. It's been a really great ride, but also National Weather Service and NOAA and the Weather Program Office and the Office of Atmospheric Research for providing our Joint Technology Transfer Initiative grant that helped fund a lot of this work, and also the National Science Foundation, because they provided me a fellowship at the beginning portion of my PhD that helped me produce some of this work as well. So with that, I will take any questions, and thank you for listening. I'm trying to expand my grid here so I can see if anyone has questions. Okay.
Yeah, Castle, there's a question in the chat.
Oh. Can you read it? I don't think I can
Okay,
access that.
says, it's from Evan Kuras. Says,
Oh, Evan, hi.
Yeah. It says, can you speak more to the structure of the scenario interviews? Since there were right and wrong answers for comparing the graphics, how did you navigate the presumed pressure your participants felt in trying to get it right? Also curious to hear your thoughts on how your research sample may differ from other publics, Georgia, College Town, etc.
Great. Excellent questions. So I will say to that question that there wasn't any pressure to get it right or wrong. So I internally knew that what the community thought was right and wrong, but I never expressed that to them or in the way that I conveyed the questions that I asked to them. They were never intuitive that there was a right or wrong answer. And in fact, a lot of them provided the wrong answer. Like, for example, in scenario 2, where it's obvious that they were in a completely different risk category, a lot of them would look at the two graphics for like 5 minutes and be like, oh yeah, they're consistent. Nothing's wrong with them. And I would just be like, okay, great. And then the way that I structured the interview is they saw one graphic first, then I took that away. Then they saw a second graphic, and then I took that away. And then I showed them both at the same time. And so through that process, a lot of them were like, oh yeah, this is showing me the same exact thing that I saw before. So I'm in the same risk category. So then when I showed them together, they looked at both of them and they're like, oh yeah, I'm in the same risk category. Then they looked a second time and they're like, oh no, I'm in a different one. So I think that in itself kind of showcases that there wasn't a right answer, even though I guess there was. But I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up, because I could see how it would be perceived as that. But I did everything as in my ability in order to reduce the tension of like, this is a test, right? I was just like, we're just showing you graphics. You're just telling me what you see. There's not a right or wrong answer. And I specifically said that at the beginning of the interview, that there weren't any right or wrong answers. In terms of the sample, are you referring to the qualitative sample? I'm guessing, Evan?
Yeah, the qualitative one, you said it was like the Athens area.
Yeah. Hang on, I got a slide that you can look at. Here we go. So overall, I would say that they were probably more educated because it was in a college town. But I did make sure to target, and the way that I did this was by reaching out to very specific individuals. So I talked to several individuals that were only high school graduates, one person that didn't have a high school diploma at all. And those conversations were very interesting and illuminating as well, especially in particular, what stands out is the risk category words. A few of them could not pronounce them and didn't know what they meant, like physically, like what the word meant. So that in itself, I think, was an interesting finding that I would not have found unless I had been able to get such a diverse sample. So I would say that we did our very best in order to create this diversity, but of course, those are limitations that come with doing a qualitative study. Other questions? I'm just that good. You guys are just blown away.
Or it's the morning and they're tired.
Oh, that's true. That's true. I forgot.
Good morning, Castle. It's Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
So I was just wondering, were your study participants already familiar with the graphics that you were showing them? Did they use them before?
Only one person said they'd ever seen them before.
Okay. And that even for broadcast, like on the news?
Yep. And that's the only place that someone had said they had seen them was
okay.
a broadcaster, a local broadcaster.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Castle. While I will save my questions for later, my husband was also listening. So I'm going to ask my husband's question.
Great.
Which is, what about planned inconsistency, where the goals of two graphics are slightly different? For example, national scope versus local scope.
Yes, that's a very good question. And it's something that I constantly tangle with. If you may be familiar with it because you read my dissertation, but I found that in the second paper that I did, when I kind of explored these qualitative aspects of consistency, that because there was so much interest in like the local aspect of it, people were drawn to the local meteorologists. If there were any inconsistencies at all, they just went straight to their local source. So in kind of the second chapter, I posed this question of like, well, if people in the face of conflict, if people just go to their local source of information, does it matter that there are these inconsistencies at these different geographical scales? So, and I think that's part of the problem with doing, not a problem, but one of the things to consider when doing mixed methods is like the way that you philosophically think about things is so different. Trying to come to terms with being able to pose these kind of really big questions while some of your more specific data is like pointing you towards, oh, well, we have these specific recommendations. But when you do the qualitative study, it's like there's a lot of room for minutia to take place. So I think those are really great questions to ask. I don't have answers to them, unfortunately, but I think that there's a lot of area for research in thinking about a lot of these different scale, how does inconsistency scale? So yeah, great question, Jimmy. Thank you. Other questions?
This is Evan again. I'll ask another question while people are thinking. I'm curious, as a weather communicator, especially who focuses on things like podcasts and Twitter, and another, like, more in the social media angle than the formal top-down perspective, how has this dissertation work changed the way that you communicate and think about consistency in messaging and cross-platform?
Ooh, that's a hard question. How have my personal practices changed? I would say that above all, I think this dissertation work in itself has taught me the value of the end user and thinking about their perspective and where they're coming from. I think when I was able to sit down with just these people that live in our community, it was very eye-opening and enlightening about some of the things that our community struggles with, that they have no, like, it's not even on their radar at all. Like, they're not even concerned about it. They're not worried about, like, just some of the things that I feel like we lose sleep over. They're not really concerned about in the slightest, which I think itself was interesting. In terms of consistency, though, I would say that I really wish that I would have kept a journal, because the way that I think about consistency has changed so much over the last 4 years. And it's gone through like these emotional waves of like, we need it, we don't need it, what am I studying, why am I doing this? So I really wish I would have documented that. I think it would have been interesting in itself. And I still kind of struggle a little bit to this day, as I kind of just articulated with the qualitative findings and the quantitative findings. They're so specific in the way that they have done, that they provide results. But it's trying to live in that minutia, I think. So I think if I were to say one thing, I would say that we need to be flexible in the way that we're being consistent. So I don't think it needs to be like this thing that this big idea, this goal that we must achieve, which I think can be seen or felt more in the weather community. I think through doing this work, I think my mindset has shifted to something that we need to move toward, but not necessarily achieve. So instead of it being like kind of a dichotomous yes/no answer, I think it's more of a spectrum of consistency that we need to move along. So I don't see us ever achieving consistency, as that may be like this crazy wild thing that I just said. Like, I don't think we'll ever achieve it. I think it's just something that we have to move toward and be conscious of as we're making and creating our messages.
Why don't we take one more question? Jennifer, your hand is
Yeah,
raised.
Jen.
Good morning, Castle and everyone.
Hi, Jen.
Hi. It was a great presentation. I really appreciated your mixed methodology, how you did both qualitative and quantitative interviews and surveys. I have a question for you with respect to the recommendations that you highlighted on your final slide, I think.
Yeah.
I think if I recall correctly, you had something about a recommendation for others, perhaps broadcasters, to be as consistent as possible with NOAA or the Storm Prediction Center and their particular graphics and products.
Yes.
Did I understand that properly? Okay.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering then, on the flip side, do you have any recommendations for SPC and NOAA based on your findings?
Very good question. Yes and no. So it's been interesting because the project that we are working on through the JETI grant is only a piece of my dissertation. So this is all the consistency related stuff. So stuff that I didn't get to touch on is, while I was doing the qualitative interviews, but also the surveys, we asked questions about the Convective Outlook graphic itself to try and figure out how to make it more user-friendly among all end users. That being making sure that the color scheme was readily understood, the risk category words were readily understood, and we continued that theme throughout the experimental studies. But I didn't get to touch on that because it's kind of beyond the scope of my dissertation. So the short answer is yes. We're working in tandem with the Storm Prediction Center to be able to provide them with feedback, qualitative feedback from end users to improve the public facing products that they issue. But we're also conducting research with some folks at University of Oklahoma to figure out, is there a better system or a better way of conveying the risk category system so that all end users can better understand and articulate their severe weather risk. So I think that's a very good point. And now that you point that out, I can see that how this may seem as though it's like, oh, the SPC is right and everyone should follow them. We're working alongside the SPC in order to improve the products that they provide, so that when we issue this recommendation for operational meteorologists and broadcast meteorologists, this product will be the best that it can possibly be.
Okay, and so just a quick follow-up. The end user in that secondary project would be the general public. The end user would not be a broadcaster. They're more like the middle user.
Correct. So I would say that broadcast meteorologists, emergency managers are also end users of the product. But in particular, I'm focusing in on members of the public, because some of our counterparts at the University of Oklahoma are investigating the Storm Prediction Center's graphics among broadcasters and emergency managers. So I kind of fill out the other end user that they're not exploring.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
All right. Why don't we kind of close out the meeting, and maybe I'll give Castle one more round of applause, whether virtually or for real.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, thank all of you for joining us. It's kind of nice to see a lot of you, especially early in the morning. And then we'll just close this to the committee. And if the committee just wants to take, why don't we just take 2 or 3 minutes to get some coffee, and then we'll reconvene here, if that sounds okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye, Castle.
Bye.
You're awesome.
Back to sleep, man. No, it's sunny now, I guess.
Enough work. You got this.